Okay, I want to begin by thanking Professor Saba Al-Nasseri and the other organizers for inviting me, and also for creating the title of the conference, The Arab Revolutions. I think that's the best way of referring to these events. My presentation is entitled Iran 2009 and the Arab Revolutions, Identities and Differences. Okay, first part is called 2011 as a World Historical Moment. According to my friend, the Brazilian Marxist-humanist writer Paulo Morel, the outbreak of the Arab Revolution signaled nothing less than the fact that, as he put it, the point of reversal of the long night of neoliberal hegemony, of the global dictatorship of unrestrained capitalism, is in sight. Now, he wrote that about a week after Mubarak's overthrow. Written in the heat of the moment, Morel surely exaggerated, but I still think we could say that if not in actuality, certainly in ideology and culture, the hegemony of neoliberalism has suffered serious blows from the Arab revolutions. Just to think about where we were, like say 20 years ago, when I was getting ready to publish my Lenin book, I found this wonderfully awful article by Richard Rorty, who wrote, in kind of summing up where radical thought was. This is in 1992. He said, well, you know, we don't need any more of these large theoretical ways of understanding the world, from Plato to Marx, and really some fusion of Habermas and Foucault is kind of what we need. And this is a line I still remember that, you know, a lot of my leftist friends won't like to hear this said, but it's the truth. We need people like Donald Trump to create wealth. I mean, you'd have to put that right up there with Bernard Lewis's prediction that American troops would be cheered as if they reached Baghdad. So I think we'll all agree that 2011 will go down in history as a revolutionary year, as important as 1848 or 1968. And not a full social revolution, of course, because a lot of my Marxist friends have emailed me and said you shouldn't use that term. But political revolution, why can't we say, you know, political revolution? And not always fully successful even as political revolutions, but nonetheless, I think we'd have to call it a world historical set of events, as Hegel liked to say. I mean, as you all know, impacting an entire region, Tunisia, then Egypt, then Bahrain, then Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and still unfolding more than 2 years later. And with, as we know, also important, and these are only the most important, most forceful echoes around the world, Spain's youth movement, the Occupy Wall Street, Israel's youth protests. Now, those all expressed explicit affinity. Now, others expressed some affinity, but not maybe direct inspiration. Wisconsin, Greece, which had been, you know, going before then, but I think got a second win. Quebec, possibly. And still others with some common features. The London riots of September 2011 didn't have an explicitly political agenda, but nonetheless happened in the context of that revolutionary year, 2011. So, okay, part two, the Arab revolutions of 2011 and since, just a few brief reflections. What is distinctive about them in a positive sense, especially where they have reached a political revolution, as in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, where at least the old state or part of it was overthrown, as opposed to stalemate or defeat, as in Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen? Well, first of all, I mean, very obviously, broad democratic aims for democracy and human rights as a global universal. I mean, think of all the discussion over the last 20 years that, whether from the right or the left, that Arab and Muslim cultures have this radical difference with the rest of the world, and therefore these notions of human rights and democracy don't apply in the same way. I think that was blown away. That whole discussion was blown away by the Arab revolutions. But secondly, and I think very new, in economic and labor dimensions. demands and certainly slogans that attack predatory neoliberal capitalism, unemployment, drawing from the very beginning, if not beginning with the poor and the working classes, as we saw, for instance, in Tunisia, but even in Syria, where those demands haven't been articulated as forcefully. Where the revolution began was in the poorest and most economically deprived areas of the country. Now, I think this more than anything, this aspect more than anything related to the Arab revolutions has helped to end the long night of neoliberal hegemony, but I'm not talking about in fact, obviously, but in terms of its ideological hegemony, or at least call it into question. Now, a third factor that everyone comments on is the youthful leadership that uses the internet in order to bypass censorship. And while we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of that, and my student Greg Burris has a wonderful article called Lawrence of Arabia, kind of satirizing and debunking the idea that these were internet revolutions. Nonetheless, certain elements of the youth have been able to use the internet effectively to communicate with each other and with the outside world. Fourthly, not led by Islamists and not with Islamist demands. Even in countries and situations where Islamist groups have had important electoral victories afterwards. In this sense, another type of long night is over. And I wrote this in an article in 2011, again, probably too optimistically, but in the heat of the moment, I think this was March 2011, the long night of the past 3 decades in which two oppressive and false alternatives battled for hegemony in the Middle East and parts of the broader Muslim world. And these alternatives were pro-imperialist and nominally secular authoritarianism, Egypt and Tunisia on the one hand, and then radical fundamentalism, Iran, or even at its most extreme, the Al-Qaeda movements and those that fed into it. These two fed on each other because the Mubaraks would say, well, if not us, then you're going to get a group like the Islamic group of Egypt that tried to assassinate our Nobel Prize-winning writer, or the Algerian Islamic group that was going around at one point shooting women wearing blue jeans. And so I would argue that the radical Islamists, I'm talking now particularly of the type that we had in the 1990s in Egypt and Algeria, they actually prolonged the life of these moribund systems that we had in Egypt, and frankly the Algerian one is still in power, partly because of what they went through in the 1990s. Third part, the Iranian upheaval of 2009, identities and differences with the Arab revolutions. What then of Iran 2009, when, from June 2009 until really December of that year, you had millions taking to the streets. At one point it was said that 3 million came out onto the streets of Tehran. It was certainly the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since its birth. And also, it was very early in the global economic crisis. I was at a conference here at that time, I think in 2010, and it was pointed out that the Iranian democratic upheaval was the largest mass democratic movement anywhere in the world that had happened since the collapse, since the Great Recession. Now, it nearly became a second Iranian revolution, but it didn't. And so I think we have to look at why it didn't also. And so I want to make a few remarks about the Iranian upheaval, comparing and contrasting it to the Arab revolutions. Let's start with the similarities. Broadly democratic. They didn't specifically say democracy, but they said they wanted serious reforms. I mean, certainly the slogans talked about serious reforms of the Islamic Republic that would have been democratizing. It was youthful. They certainly used the internet. They were the first mass uprising to use Twitter specifically to bypass the censorship. They bravely withstood beatings, torture, etc., on a mass scale, coming back month after month. And a new generation of activists was formed. And just as in Egypt a few months before, there were people who, I think the New York Times went to both, Le Monde went to Egypt and reported in November that people are very apathetic and there seems no hope of political change. That was like November 2010. The New York Times was in Iran in late 2008 or 2009 and said, the young people are totally apathetic and apolitical. They're just into pleasure and their individual lifestyles and so forth. But as Hegel also tells us, wherever there's identity, there's also difference. And of course, if you know Hegel's logic, you go from identity to difference and then to contradiction. Now, the postmodernists aren't satisfied with that because they say ultimately there's some kind of identity lurking beneath the surface. And but that's not entirely a bad thing, that there would be commonalities among all the peoples and situations in the world. Okay, but what are some differences that show some limitations of the Iranian upheaval? While certainly drawing support from the poor and the working classes, I think the notions that Ahmadinejad had a lot of support among the working class and the ruler are ludicrous. Nonetheless, the demands of the movement were at best political only, did not specifically address economic oppression, exploitation, social justice, these kinds of issues. How could they have done so when part of its leadership included wealthy state-connected families like the Rafsanjanis, possibly the wealthiest and most corrupt family in Iran? And that's saying a lot, because there's a lot of corrupt families in Iran. And then, he's a very brave man, Mehdi Karoubi, who exposed the torture and also broke taboos in terms of discussing male rape that had gone on as part of the torture in the prisons. And I certainly salute his courage and his democratic commitments. Nonetheless, in one interview, he said when the upheaval was at its height in the summer of 2009, he said, "I don't believe in strikes because strikes disrupt society." Well, okay. So at best, what we had, if we want to talk about the dominant ideologies of this movement, similar to the color revolutions of the 2000s, Serbia, Ukraine, Lebanon, that wanted democracy but did not touch issues of social justice, economic inequality. Okay, but I think there's a second thing about Iran that's even more distinctive, because that Iran did go through a major revolution in 78, 79, and it wasn't only a political revolution, it was to some extent a social revolution. The Iranian movement specifically called for changes within the system, not for the rulers to go to, or to get out, as the Arab revolutions did from the beginning. Now, of course, in Iran, if you say that, especially if you say down with Khamenei, you're committing blasphemy. You're rebelling against God, since he's God's direct representative on earth. But nonetheless, that wasn't, for whatever reason, those who would have said that until really the end, December 2009, the movement kind of stuck to the very limited slogans about reform of the system, where's my vote, this kind of thing, all through 2009. Now, part of this is just tactical. They thought there was a certain amount of political space that they could operate within. But there's something else also, because the Western press would interview these youth who would come back from like battling the Basiji police, and they'd be bloody from the conflict and say, I'm going to go back. I don't care if I die tomorrow, whatever. And then they'd say, but one thing I want to make clear is we don't want a revolution. There was a common thread that said over and over again among the youth and the intellectuals of Iran, including the fairly radical ones. This too is linked to the outcome of the 1979 revolution. Made the word revolution carry such a bad taste. People would say, what revolutions do is, you end up with a bunch of fanatics taking over. That what we need is democracy and civil society. So the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian upheaval of 2009 is ideologically still a prisoner to some extent of that discussion of democracy and civil society that we had that was so dominant in the 90s, when Marxism had supposedly died, as Richard Rorty was reflecting. And yet at the same time, I think there is a link. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to say that the Iranian upheaval inspired the Arab Spring. I think the cultural differences and barriers between Persians and Arabs are just very, very great. But I would say there's probably one connection in that Ahmadinejad was a fairly popular figure in the Arab world because of his statements about Israel and the United States, defiance of Israel and the United States, and we still see in Latin America that he's fairly popular. But day after day, seeing the Basiji beating to a pulp these demonstrators on the streets, I think you could argue that possibly to the new generation in the Arab world, it discredited Islamist authoritarianism. It possibly did that. Okay, so, but I've been kind of beating up a little bit on the Iranian movement. Now I want to go in the other direction and point to some features that show a more advanced character in some ways than the Arab revolutions, and particularly on gender. Okay, I don't think even in Greece, any Western country that I know of, did you see such prominent participation of women in large-scale street confrontations with the state. I don't know if in history we've ever seen this. I mean, there's this iconic New York Times photo that they put on page 1 where 3 or 4 Basiji have these clubs, and this guy is down and they're beating on him, and there's a middle-aged woman with her chador, and she's running, but she's not running away. She is running toward this group to throw her body in to try to stop this guy from being beaten up. There are these stories, I mean, I don't know quite how that would be said in Persian, but, you know, of young women saying, come on, let's go back out onto the streets, and aren't there any, like, men here? You know, playing that kind of using that kind of rhetoric. And of course, there had been an ongoing women's movement that preceded this. There was the Million Signatures campaign from a few years earlier. There were networks of women. There were even meetings that took place in people's homes, because there had been Islamist women, including some high up in the leadership of the Green Movement, that in their earlier days had persecuted the more secular feminists. Those feminists had held meetings in the time preceding the 2009 upheaval, where the Islamist women basically, people like Zahra Ranavard, the wife of Mousavi, basically apologized to the more secular women for the way they had acted in the early days of the revolution. So the gap between secular and religious women had receded to a great extent. And of course, a lot of the religious women, what they've been doing in Iran in recent decades, or certainly since the 90s, is creating a feminist or semi-feminist theology. Okay. Now, women were a factor certainly in the Arab revolutions, on the streets, participating alongside the men. And maybe that's a poor choice of words, alongside. I mean, the women were out there very prominently. I don't think quite as prominently, though, as in Iran. Of course, recently we've had this very interesting development in Egypt, where in the midst of all these other demonstrations that have been occurring, there have been the attempts by groups of men and women to stop sexual harassment and assaults in the middle of these demonstrations in crowds in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, that are very, very interesting and need to be looked at more. Now, a second difference that Iran has is every year more books are translated into Persian than into Arabic, even though Iran is a relatively small country. Now, just about now you can't translate and publish a book that says "Down with the Islamic Republic of Iran," or, but you can translate Foucault's History of Sexuality, for instance. I saw it in Iran in 2005, but actually the French title has something like The Politics of Truth, and then History of Sexuality, Volume 1 is actually the actual. So when they left the word sexuality out of the title, they just gave that big title. When my book on Marx was translated, last year, Marx at the Margins, Ethnicity, Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies. They just took that Marx at the Margins off and just had the book. It's a book on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies. And then you turn into the first page or so and you see what it's actually about. But when it's sitting in the window of a bookstore, it's not as clear. So there's there has been a much more cosmopolitan spirit among the Iranian intellectuals over the past couple decades, with so many translations. Now, Habermas, Foucault, all that Western critical theory, philosophy stuff gets translated really regularly. But here's some more further to the left kinds of things that have gotten translated. A new edition of Capital came out, Volume 1, came out in 2007. Sold out 10,000 copies almost immediately. The regime has since forbidden it to go into a second edition. Here's some of the authors who've been translated recently and whose work gets discussed in the daily press. Now these newspapers keep getting shut down and then new ones forming. Lukács, Dunayevskaya, Bronner, Hegel, Foucault, etc. When Hegel's Phenomenology was translated in 2005, there was a huge fight in this newspaper that's since been shut down and then reopened, Sharg, about whether the translation was any good. And this was like a newspaper that circulated several 100,000 copies. It was the one that all the intellectuals pretty much read. So, as Lenin famously said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And of course, being part of the 60s generation, we had the domination of Maoists and Che Guevara, so we all rejected that. Debray specifically said that was untrue in his book, The Revolution and the Revolution. But I think it was a decent point. But then it's also a question of what kind of theory, and I don't want to exaggerate the influence of this more left-wing Marxist type of theory and so on, because when Habermas came to Iran in the early, when Khatami was still president, I think it was around 2003, something like that, I think 10,000 people showed up to hear Habermas. And then later on, after the 2009 movement, when they were starting to have the trials, it turned out that the people who invited Habermas basically came to Iran with the instructions to start this, anti-revolutionary CIA, Mossad type plot that we saw in these 2009 upheavals. But as a whole, I think we could say that the notions of civil society and democracy in more of a Habermasian vein, coupled with that revulsion and worry about any kind of revolution, dominate even some of the more radical elements of the opposition in Iran, certainly among youth and intellectuals. So as a whole, I think we could say that the Arab revolutions went deeper, mobilized more sectors of society, and did so in a manner that called for the direct overthrow of the rulers. And this is part of why they succeeded, at least partially, that they remain ongoing, and possibly related to why Iran remains at an impasse. Finally, what next? Just a few remarks. Okay, in terms of the Arab revolutions, pretty obviously we have deep contradictions involving Islamist agendas, imperialist intervention, or at least influence, gender, unemployment, persistence of neoliberal agendas from the Muslim Brotherhood, as was mentioned earlier. The military and security apparatus often remaining, well, certainly not in Libya, but which has its whole set of other problems, but military and security apparatus remaining to a great extent intact, as in Tunisia and Egypt. But full social revolution, or at least the flavor of that, the taste of that, remains on the agenda, as we can see in these unending protests against the new order in formation, especially in Tunisia and Egypt. And of course, the question that those people have is how to move from a partially successful political revolution to a full social revolution. Now, how would one go about that, and what are some thoughts about that? And that's my conclusion. First of all, recognize the scope of the problem, of the limits of reforms. I mean, certainly the most obvious one is, Tunisia, a year after the revolution, almost 2 years after the revolution, unemployment, I think, was 13%. Now it's about 18%. Now, as Marx wrote, and this is not the Marx that was fully a revolutionary yet, but still, it's early 1843, it is not the radical revolution, not the general human emancipation, which is a utopian dream, in other words, an unrealistic dream. Rather, it is the partial, the merely political revolution, the revolution which leaves the pillars of the house standing. So that's the Marx, just as he had discovered the working class. Very, very early, though. Secondly, the problem of vision. A great political theorist, I went to a conference at UCLA 2 weeks ago around this, a very radical political theorist, Tracy Strong. His newest book is called Politics Without Vision. Now, I would argue that visions are necessary, whether slightly utopian or more real in the sense of a Marxian vision. Some kind of vision of a really new human society really is necessary. Not just anger, not just expose of capitalism. Now, it's a very hard thing to do today, especially since 1989 and the hegemony, even earlier than that, of the notions like there is no alternative. And it's not only the problem that Iran faces, but in other words, the Stalinist forms of so-called socialism, the slightly left-wing, sometimes military left-wing national populism. I mean, sure, these people like Qasem in Iraq or Nasser were a hell of a lot better than the crop of leaders that the region's had recently, but nonetheless, their politics and social programs had their limitations as well, and most very obviously, the Russian or Chinese forms. And then there has to be a real taking stock of what the real social forces are, both those of us analyzing and those of us participating on the ground. I think people on the left spend a lot of their time analyzing objective forces, state structures, the economy. Remember, after the Iranian upheaval, people were saying, turned out to be wrong, but it was an interesting thesis, that Ahmadinejad represented a new generation of leadership, that he was rooted in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a military apparatus. It's actually stronger than the army, and that he ran that. He was kind of representing that, and they were going to push aside the religious ayatollahs. We now know that the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps was in such conflict with Ahmadinejad during the suppression of the upheaval that at a meeting with a bunch of other people, he slapped him in the face. And of course, in Iran, the president is a little bit like a token figure. You can do that. There's probably a number of people who could slap the president in the face because he's more of like a flunky. I think, though, we need to look at the subjective forces or human agencies, a lot of people, and really do a serious, rigorous analysis of that. The real social forces, and in their creative development since 2011, because the workshop of revolution, of upheaval, this is a great school of self-consciousness. So to look at that and look at the real social contradictions standing in the way of a truly emancipatory revolutionary movement in the Arab world and everywhere. And I just want to end on one point, which is that I'm not a revolution or nothing type person. I'm very much in favor of raising the minimum wage in the United States right now, which is like, it's lower than it was actually in real dollars than it was when I was young. But why can't, but I think at the same time, and this is a global problem, it used to be that the people that fought for the minimum wage said this is a step on the way toward a broader set of social changes that would be revolutionary. We want to transform and destroy capitalism and substitute it with a new human system. And yes, we have these immediate, but these are linked to that broader vision and that broader strategy. So I think we need to get back to that kind of thing. And it's not easy because it has to be a real critique in the sense of the various experiments in attempts to transcend capitalism that the 20th century was so rich with. And I think that's a real, that weighs down on the living. That's a nightmare that weighs down on the living. I think a great revolutionary thinker talked about that in one of his books. Thank you.